Chapter 34 The Great War, also known as World War I. The drift toward war, and reason so, was mainly because of the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist who was the heir to the Austrian-Hungary throne. Nationalism spread by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Self-determination suggests that each ethnic group and people, as well as living as having a right to the sovereign state. The concept was ignored or opposed by dynastic powers, where they ruled other people than their own. Considerably, nationalistic tensions in the Ottoman, Habsburg, and the Russian empires. And another being Slavic nationalism, which stressed kinship of all Slavic peoples of the Eastern people into powers. The Ottoman Empire shrank as first Greece, then others gained independence. Serbs of Austria and Hungary sought unification with the independent Siberia. Russians promoted pan-Slavism in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Germany backed the Austrian-Hungarian to fight ethnic nationalism. National rivalries. The naval race between Germany and Britain increased tensions to see who can build a stronger navy. Germany's rapid industrialization threatened British economic predominance. Both states built huge iron battleships called dreadnoughts, which were the prize jewels of both sides of power and might. Colonial disputes of the late 19th century. Germany, unified in 1871, came in late to the colonial race. Germany resentment and antagonism toward both France and Britain.
Escalating national rivalries and nationalist aspirations of subject minorities spawned a system of entangling alliances. Treaties and obligations all outlined the circumstances that each country would go to war to support each other. By 1914, Europe's major powers had transformed themselves into two hostile camps, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. A dual alliance was formed between Germany and Austria-Hungary's governments, and this alliance assured reciprocal protection from Russia's attacks and neutrality in case of an attack from any other power. Italy joined, fearful of France, and formed the Triple Alliance, aka the Central Powers. French and Russian leaders were getting suspicious about this alliance, and a little after that, the Triple Entente was formed. It originated in a series of agreements between Britain and France and between Britain and Russia that aimed to solve colonial disputes. The French's plan for war revolved around Plan 17, which was a bunch of offensive maneuvers. German planners made a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, where they knocked out France, followed by a defensive attack against Russia, but this plan was a big obstacle for Germany. War came to Europe during harvest time, and most people were in shock or they were fearful. Intellectuals and young city dwellers were excited because many of them had already expected war to come. These feelings faded when reality crushed any expectation for a short and triumphant war, and soldiers were getting slaughtered by the millions. The group that killed Francis Ferdinand and that sparked the war was a group called the Black Hand, which were the unification of Slavs or Yugoslavs to form the Greater Serbia. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th after declaring that the Serbians killed Francis Ferdinand. Nicholas II took a step for Russia to mobilize against Germany when Germany's military experts said that delayed mobilization might invite defeat, so they advised that Germans enter the war. This action presented a German ultimatum to Russia on July 31st, demanding that Russian army cease immediately. On August 1st, the German government declared war on Russia and France started to mobilize, and on August 3rd, Germans declared war on France. On the same day, German troops invaded Belgium. The Belgian government called upon the signatories of the Treaty of 1839, which guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. And when the British government gave Germans an ultimatum to leave Belgium alone, Germany refused, which caused the British to join the war on August 4th. The German thrust towards Paris in August 1914 came to a grinding halt along the River Marne, and both sides raced towards the sea and ended up in the Atlantic coast. For the next years, battle lines remained stationary until the late autumn of 1918. Italy left the Triple Alliance in favor of neutrality, but then entered the war again, but this time they sided with the Allies in 1915. Italian forces maintained a defensive line with only the help of the French and the British. The stalemate on the western and southern fronts reflected technological developments that favored defensive tactiles. Barbed wire was spread across no man's land, which was a deadly territory between opposing trenches. The machine gun represented one of the most important advances in military technology, and further contributed to stalemates. Desire to reintroduce movement into the warfare led to development of poisonous gas by German troops in 1915. One of the most feared gas was a yellow gas called mustard gas that rotted the body from within, and it killed soldiers within 4 to 5 weeks of suffering. The British first introduced tanks in the late 1915, and the Allies deployed them to break down defensive trenches, but the tanks did not produce long-term effectiveness. Also introduced was airplanes, and as the war progressed, the airplanes took major developments in speed, range, and altitude, but since planes couldn't carry enough weapons, their main purpose was to act as reporters.
The most courageous of men on either side which charged through no man's land, which was the space of land or area in the middle of both sides, and they would go through artillery, barrages, and even through clouds of poisonous gas. But they were no match for the defending side, being shielded by dirt, barbed wires, and equipped with gas masks and machine guns. They would shoot down the people charging, and most of them would end up dead. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, a combination of Austrian and German forces overran Serbia, Albania, and Romania. In 1914, Russia invaded Prussia, but in 1915 they were driven out of East Prussia, and then out of Poland by German-Austrian forces. In 1916 to 1917, the Russians fought back and collapsed in a sea of casualties. Also in 1916, the Germans put a huge assault on the fortress of Verdun. The French retaliated, and the French were victorious, losing about 315,000 soldiers, and the Germans losing about 280,000. The survivors recovered about 160,000 identifiable bodies, and the rest were unrecognizable or have been blown apart by high explosives. And the British forces counterattacked at the Somme in order to relieve some pressure on Verdun. As men marched off to war, women went to work, and they would take over the jobs of the men. Behind the battle lines, women were often nurses, physicians, and communication clerks, but the most crucial work performed by women during the war was the making of ammunition. Several million women and sometimes children were put in long, hard hours in factories. This work exposed them to many dangers. There were explosions caused by sparks interacting with volatile material and working with TNT explosives. And being exposed for long periods of time could lead to TNT poisoning. Symptoms of this would be the change in skin color to yellow and their hair being orange. In order to maintain the spirit of the home front, the government resorted to the restriction of civil liberties and censorship of bad news, and the vilification of the enemy through propaganda. The European government extended their hatred to the colonies, and British and French forces recruited the colonials into their armies. Once the Great War hit global significance, Japan, the United States, and the Ottoman Empire entered the war. On the 15th of August in 1914, the Japanese sent an ultimatum to Germany demanding the handover of German-released territory of Jahozo to the Japanese authorities, and also included that the German Navy must also withdraw its warships from Japanese and Chinese waters. The Germans refused to comply, and the Japanese entered the war on the side of the Allies on August 23, 1914. On January 18, 1915, the Japanese presented the Chinese with the 21 secret demands, and if accepted, the terms would have reduced China to a protectorate of Japan. By November, the British had gained a few thousand yards at the cost of 420,000 casualties, and the Germans had a similar amount of losses. With the establishment of new rules of engagement, this made civilians targets of warfare until millions of people not in the military became targets of enemy military operations. On August 30th, 1914, a German Zeppelin dropped bombs, only killing one person. This event led to a new kind of warfare, being air war against civilians, but this also led to naval blockades, which were more effective. Military leaders on both sides used blockades to deny food to whole populations, hoping that the starving population would force their government to surrender. As a good example of this, the British blockade of Germany during the war contributed to the deaths of about 500,000 Germans. As the war continued to go past December of 1914, nations began to have their non-combatant citizens to support the war effort.
Georges Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Woodrow Wilson are the leaders of France, Britain, and the U.S., and they dominated the deliberations of the Paris settlement. The Allies threatened war if the terms weren't accepted. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were recommendations for peace treaties. The key components were open agreements of peace, freedom of navigation upon seas in peace and war, equality of trade conditions, but the Allies opposed some of these points. The Treaty of Versailles denied the Germans a navy and air force, and it also limited the size of their army, and they could not join a political unity. The Treaty of Neuvilly, which Bulgaria had to secede only portions of their territory. And the Treaty of Saint-Germain was between the Allies and the Republic of Austria, and the Treaty of Trunken was between the Allies and the Kingdom of Hungary. And with the treaties of Sevres, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and Mustafa denied these terms and became president of the Republic of Turkey. The League of Nations was an international organization to keep world peace. They had two flaws: they couldn't enforce their decisions, and they relied on collective security.
One of the key concepts they were trying to follow for the peacemaking process was the concept of self-determination. However, some places such as Germany and Australia didn't upside with these principles for security and strategic reasons. Some places such as Paris received some imperfect results as the peacemakers were trying to apply the principles of self-determination and nationalism. This is the self-determination theory. Another problem that occurred was what they were going to do with Germany's former colonies and the Arab terrorists of the Ottoman Empire. Because of this, the League of Nations divided the mandates into three classes, and they fell under the victorious powers of the Great War. The Allies viewed the mandate system as a reasonable system. The Great War changed Europe significantly, but also made their global homogeny more secure. After the Second World War, the growth of nationalism in Europe accelerated. This fueled the desire for independence and self-determination. The decline of European power was a result of a diminished economic stature. They had overcome most of the problems that came with the war, but the most significant one was the loss of overseas investment in foreign markets, which reduced their economic state. The war also spread revolutionary ideas which raised hope for people under imperial rule. The idea of self-determination continued to spread.